this preeminently the time to speak the truth frankly and boldly, nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
During the 1920s, the economy in the United States of America was in good shape and the stock market underwent rapid expansion. For the first time in history, more Americans lived in cities rather than rural areas throughout the country. Most importantly, the total wealth of the country increased to more than twice the level it was from the period from 1920 to 1929. This economic growth that occurred during this period flounced many Americans into what is known as the consumer society. Thanks to national advertising efforts and the increased amount of chain stores, people in the United States of America bought the same goods and listened to the same music. However, by 1929, there were concerns to be raised regarding the American economy. In August of 1929, there were speculations about the health of the stock market due to rising unemployment and decline of production. This left stocks in great excess of their real market value. Among other factors that existed during this time were low wages, a struggling agricultural industry, and an excess of large bank loans that could not be liquidated. From September to October 1929, the market began its roller coaster ride to the bottom, with stock prices in a decline, and by the 18th of October, events in the stock market did not point to any good news. On October 24th, a day known as Black Thursday, Wall Street broke a record by trading over 12 million shares. Leading bankers and investment companies tried their best to stabilize the market by purchasing many blocks of stock and generating a rally on Friday. On Monday, the real part of the catastrophe happened when the stock market went into a total free fall. On Tuesday, known as Black Tuesday, stock prices collapsed completely, resulting in billions of dollars of lost money, which wiped out thousands of investors and stock tickers, running hours behind schedule because the machinery was not capable of handling a tremendous large volume of trading. The effects of the stock market crash wiped out millions of investors, and things only got worse when consumer confidence vanished. Over the next several years, levels of investment and consumer spending declined, causing low levels of industrial output and rising unemployment when companies laid off workers. For individuals who managed to stay employed, wages fell, resulting in their purchasing power decreased. Many Americans had no choice but to make their purchases on credit, resulting in foreclosures and repossessions. The Depression also spread to Europe due to the gold standard, which joined countries such as the US and Europe in a fixed currency exchange. The President of the United States at the time, Herbert Hoover, believed that the government shouldn't intervene in the economy or create jobs and provide economic relief. This factor may have played a huge role in worsening the effects of the Great Depression. By 1932, 15 million people were unemployed. However, there would be one man that would change the United States forever by bringing the United States out of the Great Depression and turning the country into a superpower. On a large estate near the village of Hyde Park, New York, on January 30th, 1882, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in this bed to the parents of James and Sarah Delano Roosevelt. He was homeschooled by his parents and private tutors, and this provided him with nearly all of his formative education. He later attended law school at Columbia University, passed the bar exam, and worked in a Wall Street law firm as a clerk for a few years. In 1905, Franklin Delano Roosevelt married Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, a distant cousin and the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt. They had 6 children, in which 5 of them survived infancy. Anna, born in 1906, James, born in 1907, Elliot, born in 1910, Franklin Jr., born in 1914, and John, born in 1916. Roosevelt first entered the political atmosphere in 1910, when he was elected as a member of the New York State Senate as a Democrat, representing his traditionally Republican home district. He was re-elected in 1912 and supported Woodrow Wilson's candidacy for President of the United States. As a good deed for supporting Woodrow Wilson appointed Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913 and held the position until 1920. During Roosevelt's time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was regarded as an effective and energetic leader by pursuing a concentration in the business sector of naval administration. His success in this sector and his popularity eventually resulted in him being nominated for the vice presidency on the Democratic Party ticket in 1920, a ticket led by James M. Cox. However, the decision by Woodrow Wilson's agenda for participation in the League of Nations played a major factor in their election loss, as unpopular sentiment resulted in Warren Harding elected into the presidency. After their election loss, Roosevelt went back to the private sector. However, during this time, things would drastically change for Roosevelt. In 1921, Roosevelt was on vacation with his family in Campobello Island, New Brunswick, and during this time, he contracted polio. He never regained the use of his legs despite numerous efforts to overcome it. After being diagnosed with polio, Roosevelt created a foundation in Warm Springs, Georgia to assist other polio victims and inspire and direct the March of Dimes program that led to the eventual result of an effective vaccine. Roosevelt later resumed his political career with the help and encouragement of his wife Eleanor and his political confidant Lois Howe. He later nominated Governor Alfred E. Smith of New York for President of the United States at the Democratic National Convention. However, Alfred E. Smith lost the nomination to John W. Davis. In 1928, Smith became the Democratic nominee for president and endorsed Roosevelt as his successor for governor of New York. Although Roosevelt won the election for governor of New York, Alfred E. Smith lost the election for president of the United States to Herbert Hoover, the Republican nominee. In 1929, the United States began its plunge into the worst economic crisis in American history, known as the Great Depression. The Great Depression severely damaged President Hoover and the Republican Party. Governor Roosevelt introduced programs in New York State to help combat the effects of the Great Depression. These efforts enhanced his reputation in the political atmosphere. In Chicago in 1932, Roosevelt accepted the nomination with the Democratic Party as their nominee for President of the United States.
I regret that I am late, but I had no control over the winds of heaven and could only be thankful for my Navy training. The appearance before a national convention of its nominee for president to be formally notified of his selection is unprecedented and unusual. But these are unprecedented and unusual times. My friends, may this be the symbol of my intention to be honest and to avoid all hypocrisy or sham.
Roosevelt battled for government intervention in the economy. These programs were known as the New Deal in the areas of relief, recovery, and reform. His approach to people struggling in the Great Depression and his personality helped to defeat Herbert Hoover in the presidential election in November 1932. On March 4, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took the oath of office as the 32nd President of the United States. During this time between the presidential election and the inauguration, the Great Depression worsened. Factories were closing, farms undergone foreclosures, and the number of bank failures increased, and employment was rising to never-before-seen levels. From 1929 to 1933, the stock market had plunged 85%, and employment levels had risen to nearly 25%. In cities throughout America, people lined up for soup and bread who were unemployed. In the rural parts of the country, there was a hunger crisis. At the time, this was the greatest crisis in the history of the United States since the Civil War. Roosevelt established the New Deal programs in an effort to get the American economy back on track. The first action he took was closing banks temporarily to halt depositor panics. The second step he took was working with Congress during the first 100 days of office to pass recovery legislation. He used fireside chats on the radio to communicate his message with the American people. Ever since Roosevelt first established the first 100 days, it has been a tradition of every president into the modern times. The legislation passed during this time included alphabet agencies such as the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, to employ young men. Other agencies that Roosevelt created provided aid to business and labor, regulated the stock market, subsidized mortgage payments, created insurance or bank deposits, and provided unemployment assistance. These measures provided some confidence in the economy, but the Great Depression still dragged on. In 1933, economic growth began to increase when F.D.R. introduced New Deal programs. These efforts allowed banks to reopen and provide relief to Americans struggling from starvation. Roosevelt won re-election in 1936 by a landslide and defeated Alfred M. Landon, the Republican nominee. However, the New Deal programs resulted in increased government spending and national debt increases, which led to many criticisms from the Conservative Coalition, a group of conservative Democrats and Republicans who were opposed to the idea of government intervention in the economy. In 1937, the economy took a nosedive into another recession, in which the cause is still debated by experts because of budget cuts and actions by the Roosevelt administration to curb potential inflation. In addition, Roosevelt's actions to try to add new justices to the Supreme Court caused strong criticism, even from his vice president, John Nance Garner, who broke with him on this specific issue. This represented the low point throughout his presidency. However, in 1939, events throughout the world began to change with the war in Europe. Instead of focusing on New Deal programs, Roosevelt began to focus on foreign affairs. Although he was becoming increasingly concerned with Adolf Hitler's attack on Poland in September 1939, he did not declare war at the moment. Instead, he tried to provide aid to Britain, China, and France. He also tried to obtain an amendment for the Neutrality Acts, which was difficult. However, he did take measures to build up the armed forces. In 1940, there was much debate about Roosevelt running for a third term. At the time, there were no term limits for president, and he was planning to retire. But Roosevelt changed his mind because of the war in Europe. John Nance Garner decided to run against Roosevelt for the nomination for president, but failed, and Henry A. Wallace was selected as his vice presidential nominee. After winning the 1940 presidential election, Roosevelt continued to aid the war in Europe, and economic conditions in the U.S. improved drastically because of it. By the fall of 1940, Hitler attacked France, which changed Roosevelt's policy in dramatic ways. Congress enacted a military draft, and Roosevelt enabled the nation to provide aid to nations at war with Germany and Italy through a Lend-Lease bill.
Our present program will train 800,000 additional men this coming year, and somewhat less than 1 million men each year thereafter. It is a program, obviously, of defensive preparation, and of defensive preparation only. To the 16 million young men who register today, I say that democracy is your cause.
America's factories were hard at work and producing at levels in years before the Great Depression. Although America was neutral in the war and still at peace, it was ready to fight back if necessary. That moment when America fought back came on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The day after the attack, Roosevelt gave a speech to Congress and declared war against Japan.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
A few days later, on December the 11th, 1941, he declared war on Germany and Italy following their response to Roosevelt's decision to declare war on Japan. He successfully carried out his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. As a wartime president, he actively worked with his military advisors, principal field commanders, and made wartime decisions. Roosevelt believed that all nations fighting the Axis powers, which included Japan, Italy, and Germany, should refrain from making a separate peace and made them agree to pledge themselves to a peacekeeping organization upon declaring victory. This peacekeeping organization is now known as the United Nations. Roosevelt's main priorities at this time were working with General George Marshall, the White House Chief of Staff, to design a holding operation in the Pacific and organize forces for an invasion of Europe. In November 1942, the US and its allies invaded North Africa. In 1943, they continued their plans and invaded Sicily and Italy. On June 6, 1944, D-Day landings on the Normandy beaches in France were later followed by a joint invasion of Germany 6 months later into the war. Victory in Europe was certain by April 1945. However, the stress of being a wartime president finally hit Roosevelt's physical health. In early 1944, he undergone a full medical examination that revealed serious cardiological issues, including serious heart and circulation problems. Doctors prescribed him medication and a strict diet, and the pressures of World War II and managing domestic affairs at the same time placed a heavy burden on the president. There were signs that his health was deteriorating. Photographs that were taken from Yalta visibly showed his physical health deteriorating. People that were close to him, however, worried since his re-election campaign that he was not in good health. During a speech on March 1, 1945, legislators in Congress were surprised and shocked by his physical appearance. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt suffered a serious stroke, never regained consciousness, and died nearly 2.5 hours later. He was 63 years old at the time of his death. The death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt occurred on the eve of a major military win in Europe and was months away from declaring victory in Japan. The death of F.D.R. took the world by surprise, and the public was not aware of the seriousness of his medical condition. After his death, the Ferdinand Maligan train returned the coffin of the president to Washington on April 14, 1945. Over 500,000 people watched silently as the coffin was transported from Union Station in Washington, D.C. to the White House, as it was held on occasion in a military procession. After the coffin was brought into the White House, it was placed in the East Room, where it stayed for 5 hours. During this time, hundreds of friends and relatives gathered in the East Room at the wake. Thousands more were gathered around iron fences of the White House. After the funeral service, the cashin left the White House and returned to Union Station. The coffin was placed on a train bound for Roosevelt's home in Hyde Park, New York, where the president would be buried. In almost all historical polls, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ranks within the top 10 presidents, and his policies still have an effect in the political atmosphere, and his lessons have significant historical importance.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.